In this lecture, I want to deal with the results of the defeat of the Ottoman army at Vienna on September 12, 1683. The defeat of this grand army and the death of Kara Mustafa plunged the empire into a political and military crisis. And it resulted in a long war, sometimes called the Grand Turkish War, that stretched from 1684 to 1699. In some ways, it resembled the earlier Holy Leagues. In other ways, this war was a preview to the wars of the 19th and 20th centuries. That is, coalition warfare in which the various participants have separate aims, and in the end, actually conclude separate treaties with the Ottoman state. But the main fighting was concluded by the Treaty of Karlowitz on January 6, 1699. And that date is taken as a decisive point, a turning point in Ottoman history. Because for the first time, the Sultan, the then ruling Sultan, and his name was Mustafa II, he had to come to terms with the European diplomatic system. He could not dictate terms as previous sultans did to defeated foes, but he had to essentially abide by the diplomatic rules that had been in effect in Europe since the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. And that meant the Ottomans now had a new status in the international order of Eurasia. Well, let's first look at the war and then see what that treaty did, and then finally the responses to that treaty by the Ottoman state, which now understood that more was needed than just the moral reform of the Kapurli Grand Viziers. First, the war itself went very, very poorly for the Ottoman army. It was bad enough that the army was virtually annihilated at Vienna in 1683. That meant that the Ottomans had to raise a new field army. They had to increased recruiting drives for the Janissaries, called very heavily on the Timurids, but a new field army was put on the battlefield. Meanwhile, the Habsburgs were joined by Venice and by Poland, Lithuania, in a grand alliance to take out the Ottoman state and roll back the frontiers. The victory at Vienna gave Leopold I of Austria the chance to realize the Habsburg dream of gaining back all of Hungary. Within a year, Habsburg forces occupied the city of Buda and drove the Janissaries and the Timurids in the area south into what is the Sanjak of Serbia, the regions along the Sav River. In 1687, a major battle was fought at the same place that the decisive battle had been fought in 1526 on the Mohacs River, where Louis II had gone down, and this time Charles of Lorraine crushed the Ottoman field army. It was an embarrassment. The Ottoman army was destroyed. The new Grand Vizier, Sari Suleiman, was deposed. Mehmed IV was beside himself. The second field army had just gone down in defeat. Mehmed immediately summoned the second son of Mehmed Kapurli as the new Grand Vizier. He took charge, raised yet a new army, a third field army to protect Belgrade, which was now under threat, and as I mentioned, the linchpin to the Ottoman domains in the Balkans. He did reoccupy Belgrade in 1690. He chased out a Habsburg garrison, but in the next year, Mustafa Kapurli and the Ottoman army went down in yet another defeat at the Battle of Slakoman, in which the Ottoman forces suffered heavy casualties and the Grand Vizier himself fell in the fighting. It was an incredible embarrassment. Meanwhile, Mehmed IV had been deposed by his half-brother, Suleiman II, who in turn had died and was succeeded by yet another half-brother, Ahmed II. There was no direction from the sultans. The three sultans were all figureheads. The Kapurli Grand Vizier had been killed. Three field armies had been destroyed. And the result was Mustafa II, the son of Mehmed IV, was proclaimed Sultan in 1695, and he took the field to try to check the Christian advance. And initially he did a very credible job, but in 1697 he made the mistake of crossing swords with a new Habsburg commander, Prince Eugene of Savoy. Clearly one of the great captains of all time, a man who would distinguish himself in the War of the Spanish Succession as the colleague of John Churchill, the Duke of Marlborough. And Mustafa had the unfortunate honor of fighting a military genius, just as his distant ancestor, Bayezid the Thunderbolt, had fought Tamerlane. And for the first time since the defeat at Angora, the Sultan himself was personally defeated on the battlefield. It was, again, another crushing defeat, a fourth defeat, and at that point, Mustafa had no choice but to negotiate. What is remarkable is Mustafa survived the defeat to negotiate a treaty. And what had complicated the war is just before the defeat, the Battle of Zenta in 1697, where Eugene of Savoy essentially surprised and destroyed the Ottoman army. A new competitor entered the field, and that was Peter the Great of Russia, who took the city of Azov and attempted to break into the Black Sea and join the belligerents with his own aims, which was to win a warm water port on the Black Sea and launch a Russian navy. So in 1699, Mustafa II was in a hopeless military position. After losing 4 field armies, we don't have accurate records on what the fiscal situation is, but the Ottoman state just could not continue the war. Well, it was bad enough losing on the battlefield to the new tactics of pike and musket and supporting light artillery that had been pioneered in the 30 Years' War. What was worse is they now had to negotiate along the lines of what Europeans would call the balance of power. And these are the negotiating techniques that are evolved out of the 30 Years' War, that are enshrined in the Peace of Westphalia, which in many ways is seen as the emergence of modern diplomatic protocol and diplomatic aims. That is, one can do achieve a mediocre victory or even suffer a defeat on the battlefield, but with clever diplomats can actually walk away with at least a reasonable peace, if not winning the peace. Well, Mustafa and his servants were in no position to carry out these negotiations. And when they finally sat down to negotiate the Treaty of Karlowitz, which is on the frontier between the Habsburg Empire and the Ottoman Empire, it's actually would pass into Ottoman territory, they were really out of their depth. First, there were no translators available. As I mentioned in earlier lectures, the Ottoman military elite, the Askari, saw no reason to learn European languages. And the negotiations were carried out in Italian. And there were no Ottoman Muslims who knew Italian. They had to turn to, again, their Christian subjects. The man who did most of the negotiating was a translator. His name is Alexander Mavro Kordatis, a very, very prominent family that would later produce important members of the Greek War of Independence in the early 19th century. And he wasn't really a professional diplomat. He trained at the University of Bologna in medicine. But he happened to be fluent in Italian, and he could negotiate with the very, very polished diplomats of both Austria and Venice and Poland, Lithuania. Peter the Great actually held out and signed his own treaty about a year later, the so-called Treaty of Constantinople, where he gained his warm water port at Azov as compensation. So on the whole diplomatic front, the Ottomans were really not in the best of position to even understand how to negotiate a treaty on terms of equality. Second, they were really in no position to oppose the annexations. Venice took over the Morea, that is the Peloponnesus. It regained islands in the Aegean and reasserted its position and reversed the decision of 1669. Austria, or to be more accurate, the Habsburgs, the Holy Roman Emperor, he received all of Hungary. Transylvania, the so-called region known as the Banat, the northern sections of Bosnia, all of that were now incorporated into the Habsburg state, which was vastly expanded, and now the chance of the Ottoman sultans ever threatening Vienna had passed. Palatia, that important northern province that had been captured, well, that's returned to Poland-Lithuania. And as I said, Peter the Great picked up his own areas on the Black Sea by an independent treaty negotiated with Mustafa II. The territorial losses were significant. Furthermore, as a result of these territorial losses, the Ottomans really lost contact with the Crimean Tatars, which now came under severe pressure from Cossacks, whether serving for in the name of Lithuania and Poland or serving the Tsar Peter the Great, that they were put on the defensive. They could not be supported from Constantinople, and in effect, the entire control of the Black Sea was under threat. In the Balkans, the frontier had now fallen back to Belgrade. It was where it was in 1521, and the Ottoman state was now put in a defensive situation. Furthermore, think about it for a moment. 4 major defeats between 1683 and 1697. The losses were tremendous. Experienced officers and men. And there is very little reason to be surprised that starting in 1703, with the accession of Ahmed III, there was a major effort to restore the army, to bring in French engineers and artillery officers to improve artillery, and to make some sort of technological changes within the Ottoman army to counter the fact that the Europeans had won these major battles so suddenly and no longer were kept in thrall by the image of the invincible Turk. That had been shattered on these various battlefields since 1683. And so the Ottoman state was really now thrown on the defensive. Now, that does not mean that decline was inevitable at this point. Many older textbooks will give the impression that it's a direct line from the Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699 to the Treaty of Sèvres and the Treaty of Lausanne, which ended the Ottoman Empire at the end of the First World War. And it wasn't nearly as simple. The Ottoman state still had resources and able men capable of coping with some of these setbacks. It was, for one thing, a shattering defeat for Ottoman control of the Balkans, but it did not cause any major loss of face of the Sultan Caliph in the rest of the Islamic world. As far as we can tell, in the Arabic provinces, the distant defeats on the northern frontiers were really very little concern in cities like Cairo and Damascus, and Ottoman administration and daily life continued as usual. The real changes were only in the northern frontier areas, where Ottoman Timurids had been dispossessed of their lands and had to relocate farther south in Rumelia. Wallachia and Moldavia were still held, as well as the strategic fortresses on the Black Sea, Kilia, Ankerman, Bendar, forts that the Ottomans would hold down to 1812. There was hope that the situation could be turned around. And Ahmed III and his immediate successors, the Sultan Mahmud and eventually Mustafa III, made serious efforts to carry out those reversals of the territorial losses. And there were some significant victories won in the early 18th century. Peter the Great, for instance, got himself surrounded on the Prut in 1711 and had to negotiate out of inevitable defeat by handing Azov back to the Ottomans. Venice lost the Morea in 1718 when the Ottomans ganged up on Venice while the rest of Europe was distracted in the War of the Spanish Succession. And even more impressively, new threats emerging in Iran were easily parried. And in 1726, the Ottoman state picked up an enormous amount of real estate in the east, particularly eastern Armenia, Georgia, Baku. It even controlled the cities of Hamadan and Tabriz under a treaty arrangement in 1726 when the Safavid dynasty had fallen 4 years earlier, and there was a complicated set of political civil wars and instability in Iran. And when Iran later got its act together under Nader Shah, who is often regarded by the Iranians as the Alexander the Great of Iran, who spent more of his time beating up Uzbeks and the Mughal Empire, the Ottoman state held those eastern conquests and was able to negotiate satisfactory treaties in the east. So overall, the Ottomans did quite well in keeping what they still held in 1699. And there was only one major setback in 1718, where they blundered in, Ahmed III blundered into a war with the Habsburgs again, and Prince Eugene of Savoy turned up, inevitably won a great victory. captured Belgrade, and from 1718 down to 1739, the Austrians actually controlled Belgrade in northern Serbia. But again, this was lost and returned to the Ottomans under treaty in the Treaty of Belgrade in 1739. So in the first half of the 18th century, as catastrophic as these defeats seemed to be, the Ottoman state showed enormous amount of resilience. I put a lot of credit to Sultan Ahmet III in carrying out these reforms. He was the sultan who ended the Kapurli dynasty. After 1711, no more of these dynasts were summoned. He cracked down on the Janissaries because there had been a succession of mutinies during the defeats in the Grand Turkish War and had resulted in the toppling of two different sultans. He also made great efforts to control the irregular forces and the Ions in the Balkan provinces, who grew overly powerful because increasingly the Ottoman state had to depend on irregular militia units and the so-called Levantler, the irregulars. Essentially, it's a nice way of saying brigands. That is, mercenary forces that were hired to fill out the ranks after these successive defeats. He made a great deal of effort to tie the Ottoman aristocracy to the court. He sponsored a whole new cultural life. He's the man behind the so-called tulip period I discussed earlier with visual arts, especially the redecoration of the Topkapi Palace, the promotion of new fashions and spices, including tulip mania, which would get the upper classes of Istanbul or Constantinople tied to the monarchy, spending money and seeking service under the Sultan Caliph in order to supplement their incomes. He was an extremely able ruler. And if he had had a bit more foresight, and it's probably unfair to hold this to him, you know, he could only operate within the limitations of his own time. But if he was able to carry out the reforms that are attempted a century later at Tanzimat in 1839, if he tried to do that in, say, 1730 rather than in 1839, the history of the Ottoman Empire could well have been quite different. He made great strides in restoring the imperial situation as a result of that catastrophic war. That makes what follows all the more devastating. And as I mentioned in an earlier lecture, the emergence of Russia as the prime foe of the Ottoman state and this long tradition that has persisted down to this day of Russians and Turks being mortal enemies, that was quite unexpected. When Peter the Great in 1696 entered the Grand Coalition against the Ottomans in the aftermath of their defeat at Vienna, Russia was still on the horizon. It was largely shielded from the Ottoman state by the Crimean Tatars, who dominated the steppes of southern Russia and spent most of their time slave raiding against the Commonwealth of Poland-Lithuania. And what the Ottomans could not see is how Peter I had reformed the Russian army. His great reforms had created a new Russian state, with a service aristocracy and a system of conscription in which the army would be swept up and trained to European standards as professional soldiers. Peter the Great was in a position to bring in large numbers of Western Europeans, especially Germans, who could instruct his soldiers. And with this army, he could forge a new state and essentially burst upon the European political scene as a great power. And this was largely not evident to the Ottomans. And in fact, in 1711, the remarkable victory they won over Peter probably was very, very reassuring to the Ottomans that the reforms of Ahmet III were more than sufficient. As I said, Peter was forced to negotiate and relinquish his possessions that he had taken in 1700. And then Peter got locked in his great Northern War with Charles XII of Sweden. He eventually clobbered him at the Battle of Poltava. And the Ottomans were really quite capable of just really, ignoring Russia. Well, how did the Russians emerge all of a sudden as a threat and supplanted the Habsburgs? Well, there are several factors that were in play. First, the Ottoman army that came out of the reforms of Ahmet III was sufficient to defend the empire quite successfully. as far as we can tell, and there's a wonderful monographic literature on this, the Ottomans still maintained a certain technological proficiency. Studies in gun casting in the 18th century shows that the Ottomans were able to cast guns more or less on par with their European competitors. In terms of state finances, again, for all of the difficulties in those great wars, the tax farming system still worked. There was still loyal ties between the provincial periphery areas, the ions, the various private armies could still be co-opted. The Janissary Corps was rebuilt. A new set of officers were put in charge, loyal to the sultans, and this was particularly the work of Ahmed III and his successor Mahmud I. There were even efforts to set up a engineering school. The Sultan Mustafa III invited a French engineer, a fellow by the name of Francois, Baron de Tott, who came and set up a military academy in Constantinople to train Ottoman engineers and artillery officers so they could be at par with their European contemporaries in the mid-18th century. And what was even more significant is that this particular French officer was not required to convert to Islam, whereas in previous instances, when Europeans came to offer their services to the Ottoman state, conversion to Islam was a requirement. And that was a significant change and a very, very pragmatic approach by these later sultans in the 18th century of what they needed to do to brace for the next European war, and they probably thought it would come from Austria. Instead, it came from Russia. And there was a complicated political situation in Central Europe. Poland, Lithuania did not fare well in the late 17th century, early 18th century, and by the mid-18th century, the country was in confusion, and the result was Austria, Prussia, and Russia were getting ready to partition Poland. And eventually these partitions would be carried out in 1772, 1793, and 1796, and Poland would disappear from the political map. Well, this concerned the Ottoman state. They shared borders with the Commonwealth, particularly along the Principality of Moldavia. And the biggest beneficiary of this would be the Tsarina of Russia, Catherine the Great. Herself a remarkable ruler, actually a German princess who reinvented herself as an Orthodox Tsarina. The wife of Peter III, who was deposed in 1762, and she ruled in her own right until her death in 1796. Well, Catherine the Great drove the Poles into rebellion, and the so-called Confederacy of the Bar appealed, of all places, to the Ottoman Sultan. And there were all old ties between parts of the Polish nobility and the Porte. Mustafa III, championed these, and it resulted in a declaration of war in 1768. The Ottoman state went into a war without any idea of what had happened to the Russian army since Peter's time. Catherine the Great had brought in all sorts of officers from Central Europe, and this is an army trained in the techniques of Frederick the Great. And when the war erupted, the disparity between the two empires became painfully evident. The Russians were able to put on the battlefield 350,000 men in a conscript system commanded by superb European-drilled officers on par with their European contemporaries, fully knowledgeable in the use of musket and bayonet and field artillery, and the Ottoman army, for all of its efforts, still depended very heavily on the Janissaries, the Timurids, and above all, the various irregular formations and militia units, and they were just not up to the job. The Ottomans still had a very good logistical system. They could produce artillery, but it could no longer achieve victory on the battlefield against a modern army, and the results were devastating. In 1768, 2 Russian armies invaded the Romanian principalities, and in the next year, they penetrated right into the Ottoman Empire proper. And the succession of defeats were embarrassing. What was even worse, a Russian navy launched from St. Petersburg under Prince Alexis Orlov and essentially officered by British British naval officers, sailed around through the Straits of Gibraltar and in the summer of 1770 surprised the Ottoman fleet at the city of Chesme, which is near the modern city of Izmir. It's a major resort center today, and sunk the Ottoman fleet. And for the next several years, the Russian Navy ruled the Aegean, and it could have actually seized Constantinople if Orlov had had a bit more imagination. A rebellion broke out in the Morea. And these Ottoman defeats underscored several problems. One, the ineffectiveness of the Ottoman field armies against the Russians. Two, the Orthodox populations in the Balkans would welcome an Orthodox Tsarina and her army in a way they would never have welcomed the armies of the Catholic kings of Hungary or of later Austria. And the result is there was now the danger of serious disaffection and rebellion within the European provinces that were so important to the Ottoman state. And the Sultan really had no choice. Mustafa III essentially had to agree to a treaty, and there again, he was helped a great deal by the European diplomatic situation because the then ruling Holy Roman Emperor, Joseph II, intervened on behalf of the Ottoman state, and the result was a very important treaty known as the Treaty of Küçükçay-Narça. And that treaty essentially marked the end of the Ottoman state as a great power, a power unto itself. The whole area of the Crimean Tatars was essentially given to the Russians as a protectorate. The Russians who had occupied the Romanian principalities gave them back, but future Russian armies could always move on them. Austria was rewarded with certain territorial concessions. But the worst provision in the entire treaty was that henceforth, the Orthodox ruler in Moscow had a moral and religious responsibility for the Orthodox subjects of the Ottoman Empire. That is, he would henceforth represent the interests of Orthodox Christians who were subjects of the Sultan Caliph. And the estimate is, when this treaty was signed in 1774, that was somewhere on the order of 1/3 to 40% of the then population of the Ottoman Empire. This is a remarkable indication of how bad that defeat had been. And the Russians had finally gained essentially their warm water port that had gone back to the policy of Peter the Great. However, the treaty almost made a second Russo-Turkish war inevitable. The defeat of the Ottoman state in the First Russo-Ottoman War that ended in a humiliating treaty must have broken the heart of Sultan Mustafa III. And his successor, Abdul Hamid I, was determined to reverse the terms of that treaty. The defeat had been unexpected. The Russian foe had proved absolutely overwhelming, both in its tactics, its weapons, and the sheer size of the Russian armies that could be mobilized. The Russian armies would suffer enormous casualties because of the primitive logistical system, but the Tsar had the manpower to make up the losses. And Catherine the Great, ever the relentless imperialist, steadily colonized the regions of the Crimean Tatars. Muslims were now being expelled and pushed into the Ottoman state, both from the South Russian steppes and from the regions to the north of the Caucasus, which had been home to a number of important Muslim peoples long allied to the Ottoman state. And this is the first major displacement of Muslims by the Russians into the Ottoman Empire, and this would continue into the 19th century with dire consequences. In 1787, the Sultanate was essentially forced into a war with the Russians when Catherine violated the terms of the treaty and essentially annexed the Crimea and began building those so-called famous Potemkin villages, and above all, the city of Odessa as the new Russian port on the Black Sea. And the war did not go well, just as in the case of the first conflict with the Russians. The Russian armies were able to sweep again into Wallachia and Moldavia and occupy the principalities by 1788. And they could bombard the great fortresses on the shores of the Black Sea, which fell to overwhelming Russian artillery bombardments in 1788. And furthermore, this time, Joseph II of Austria actually entered into the alliance and invaded Bosnia and Wallachia with his own territorial aspirations and contacted the then reigning French King Louis XVI to join the alliance. Greeks again rebelled in the Morea, and the result was the Sultan Abdul Hamid essentially died of a broken heart from all of these defeats, and his young successor, Selim III, had no choice but to sign the Treaty of Jassy in 1792. This confirmed the Russian conquest. The Austrians took over the region known as Bukovina, which was separated from Moldavia, and the Ottomans found themselves in a really strategic disadvantage in the Black Sea region. The entire system constructed by Mehmet II at his death in 1481 that had created an outer ring to defend Constantinople and to control the Black Sea essentially had collapsed. The reason that more territory was not lost under the Treaty of Jassy is that both the Tsarina and the Holy Roman Emperor were distracted. By 1792, there was a new threat, revolutionary France. And the monarchs of Europe turned their attention to confronting this threat of a revolutionary army based on a levée en masse that threatened to overthrow the entire order of crowned rulers in Europe. And Selim III received an incredible reprieve and could carry out reforms of the state now that the war had been concluded. What he didn't know, and he couldn't have expected, that the next war would not come from the foe, Russia, but would come from an entirely unanticipated direction from the far west, from the French Republic itself, when Napoleon Bonaparte, under the orders of the French Directory, landed in Alexandria on July 1st, 1798, and brought with him an army and a revolution which would change the Ottoman Empire.